control custody in December of last year. And I bring you Jacqueline and Felipe really to make all those statistics that I just laid out a little real in terms of who are the people who are coming. Jeanne spoke before about the issue of asylum, and it's really important to understand that most of the things Trump has been trying to do are an out-and-out violation of international asylum protocols to which the U.S. is a signatory, which guarantees that a person who is unable to remain in their country because of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social or political group has the absolute right to come to this country and seek asylum. And our own U.S. asylum law, in fact, essentially says the same thing, that a person who is physically present may, irrespective of their status, may apply for asylum in this country. And Jeanne and I believe one of the central things we have to keep pushing the administration and the Congress on is that the asylum laws are adhered to. So when you come to the U.S. and seek asylum, you need to turn yourself in at the border, whether that's at a port of entry or elsewhere, and you're supposed to do that within 14 days of arrival. It's happening much sooner than that these days, or 100 miles of the border. You should then immediately have a credible fear interview to determine whether you have the beginnings of a claim for asylum. A piece of what has been a real interference in that process in the last months from the Trump administration is the Trump administration's attempt to remove fear of gang violence or domestic abuse as part of the criteria you could use to claim credible fear. And at the moment, in March of this year, we have Trump talking about ending all asylum claims regardless of whether you have a demonstrable, credible fear, and also wanting to end the visa lottery system in which a certain number of people from every country every year can apply for a visa, and it's drawn by lottery once they meet the basic criteria in their home country. We also have the Remain in Mexico policy, which went into effect January 25th of this year, which its official name is Migrant Protection Protocol, in which single adults are being turned back and held in Mexico. And they are able to do that because they're coming from Guatemala or Honduras, a country that is not contiguous with the United States. This was first put into place in San Ysidro out near San Diego. It has since been expanded to El Paso and Calexico, California, and the desire is to put it in place all across the Texas border and all across the California border, ultimately New Mexico and Arizona also. And you see, by forcing people to remain in Mexico, the administration is sidestepping the right to apply for asylum because you're on U.S. soil. This applies to people who come legally with a visa as well as illegally without any entry papers. They are not detained, they have to find their own housing, or Mexico or other shelter systems have to provide them housing. There is no initial interview. They are retained in Mexico until their first court date. They are then bused into the U.S. for those court dates, and that may be multiple court dates. We have all of these, if you remember the figure a couple of slides back, 100,000 new apprehensions in March, and just March alone. At the beginning of this year, there were already 800,000 people waiting for their asylum hearings in the U.S. court system, plus all the arrivals that we have had since then. Here are some things that are either happening or the Trump administration is working on that we urge you to keep track of. So Trump again has moved Border Patrol agents from wherever they were posted to the border itself. 750 moved recently, talk of moving another 200,000 with this, of 2,000, thank you, with the desire to increase the apprehensions. Now the problem, one of the problems in that is in moving those Border Patrol agents, they are moving them from the official commercial points of entry. And it is through those commercial points of entry that the largest amount of illegal drugs come into this country. So we are taking steps that have the great probability of increasing apprehensions, but decreasing the amount of effort to stop drug traffic into this country. You see from the numbers that over the last 20 years, the number of Border Patrol agents has increased by 10,000. You see that the budget has more than doubled, and the requested budget for fiscal year 2020 is actually even larger than there was for last year. As I mentioned, there's an effort to completely decimate the Flores agreement, and in fact, one of the other big problems that is happening is if and when there is a credible fear interview taking place, it is not being done by someone who is trained in that process, but it's being turned over to the average Custom and Border Patrol person, and that is a violation of our immigration law that says those interviews need to be done by trained people. If Trump had his way, he would eliminate all judicial review. He would end the concept of being able to bring your family members with you, called chain migration. He would end birthright citizenship, which says any child born in this country is a citizen of this country. He would like to see there be an immigration czar put in place, and he would like to end all aid to the countries of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. He says quite curiously that they haven't done enough for us, which I think is just really amazing, because I thought aid was supposed to help them, not us. So I know that's a lot of information. We do want to get to some questions and answers in a bit, but I'm going to hand this back to Jeanne to pull it together for us.
If you look at this slide, I think it says it all. And we're sitting there on a Sunday in front of the wall that's up. And we're sitting in front of the barrier where they had built the fence around it so that you weren't right at the wall. And all along that's what you have. And there were people jumping over the barrier, because at Fort Benning what they did was they went over the wall and did civil disobedience, basically. They were doing the same thing here, basically, because it was Border Patrol property. The idea is you're not supposed to be on it, but that's where people go, to the wall, to meet their friends or to pass things through or whatever. I mean, that was very important. And while we were on this side, there were people on the other side, all during the time that we were there at the encuentro. The encuentro took place in both places. So if you look at this, the idea of these people was to set a barrier up, so if the border police came, they had to go through us to get to the people that were inside. Now, they didn't choose to do that. They just let it be in terms of who went in and just, did nothing. But if you look at what's written here, to speak of borders is to speak of the greatest human tragedies as well as policies that criminalize, as Sonny has pointed out, exploit, disappear, and kill people seeking a life of dignity worldwide. And this is really what we're facing. When I talked about that civilization of wealth and civilization of poverty, that's really an indication of what is happening today in the world. Because of the distribution of wealth, particularly, and of land particularly, right across the world. When I was here doing Jim Harney's talk, at that time, that's 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I gave a statistic that said 500 people in the world at that time had as much income and wealth as 3 billion people in the world at that time, okay? So we were probably 1 billion less than we are now. So again, it was almost half the population of the world. 500 people had as the wealth that all those folks had. Today, 10 years later, and this is a good example of what is happening in terms of inequality. Today, 8 people in the world have more than 50% of the population of the world, the 7 billion people. 8 people. That is immoral, unjust. In a religious tradition, it is sinful, and it has been named that throughout the traditions. And that, in a sense, is what is happening in the world right now and at our border, and even inside our borders, really. So the big question for us is, how do we really change that? What is the mode in which we do it? And going to the border, I think, is inspirational and difficult in some ways. Difficult to be there and to know what's happening. But these are not victims. They don't perceive themselves as victims. That's the thing I think we need to really get into our heads. These are people who made a decision, a courageous decision, to get up and to go. And to free themselves was the idea, and to make it possible for them to be family or to be able to live just as human beings with dignity. And that's the message to us. And what is happening there is that the communities on the border are responding. When those refugees are let into the country and just dumped because they have no room for them in the detention centers, there's a whole chain, a whole network in the communities that involve churches, organizations, the city community, individual families that are feeding people, sheltering them, making phone calls, taking them to bus stops. So the evil that we do as a nation brings out a response that in many ways is the good. And it's like having that that difference when in 1945 we were talking about the empire and the grand planning, and on the other hand you were talking about human rights and the Human Rights Declaration. The vision of the world, that's the struggle that we're still in. Those visions are what it's all about. And coming to community church, it's like speaking to those people that we know where the vision is. I mean, this is probably the most socialist church in the country, at least in my recognition of it way back. It had many, many people that were associated with that particular perspective, and probably still do. I think we need to change the language of that in our country, because we've been conditioned to think that if we want to have people to have shelter and housing and education and food, that's an evil thing, that you should do it for yourself, that whole individualistic kind of thing. And not seeing that we live in a society that there are social rights and there are economic rights, that it's not just political rights, that if you don't have a base in society where you have work that gives you dignity, that gives you the ability to be a human being, and you don't have the setup in your country where the government is fostering that and making it possible, which is impossible now in our country, no matter what is said in the election process, to do because of our military budget. All of these things are connected, And the border, I think, really points that out. And it's a question of making those connections and really struggling for this, knowing that when we struggle for this, we're struggling for a much larger thing. And I think possibly that's really where I'd like to end it, and thank you for coming and listening. And ask if there are any questions or comments.